Hello and welcome to this CNBC Africa special. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, two questions keep coming up as we ponder the damage caused by COVID-19. How is Africa going to feed its people in very difficult times, to say the least? Secondly, how is African business going to build for the future when present survival is maybe uppermost in most people's minds? Where is the money going to come from in both cases? Just two questions among the many in determining Africa's unified and coordinated response to COVID-19. Now, joining me today is Njombo Lekula, the MD for cement company, PPC, Southern Africa, concerned with rebuilding the future, and Sandy Bukula, the interim CEO of Operation Hunger, an organization that is concerned obviously with feeding people on this continent. If I could start with you first, Mr. Lekula. How much damage do you think has COVID-19 done to the infrastructure and business of the African continent?
Well, good morning to you and good morning to your viewers. I think it is a massive. Anyone that says they can actually estimate what the damage is and the damage going forward, I think you'll be probably very wrong. So what we can say is that it has had a huge damage. However, it also presented us an opportunity to look at ourselves as a continent and say, what can we do to change the course of the continent? And I think there are a lot of opportunities to do that going into the future.
If I can move to you now, Sandy Bukula from Operation Hunger. What about the human cost? There are many stories that we're covering here on CNBC Africa during this pandemic of people running short of food. Not just because they don't have any money, but often the food isn't there. How are you trying to calculate the human cost of this pandemic?
Thank you, and good morning to your viewers. Just to say, it has been quite a challenging a period because before the COVID-19, our unemployment in South Africa specifically was sitting at about 6.7 million unemployed people. And during the COVID-19, it was estimated that the people that would lose jobs is basically sitting at 370,000 people. Now, you would know that South Africa is quite, a dynamic country because we haven't really quantified, the people that are not necessarily quantified through the formal economy, but the ones that are working through informal economy, such as people that are owning businesses, small businesses, people that are street vendors, that were actually had efforts to bringing income prior to the COVID-19 by themselves, and now, of course, they cannot continue receiving the same type of income. So it has been quite a very difficult period to actually quantify those. But I will say that we have seen quite a lot of people, requesting immediate aid and just not having access to food directly. So that has been our dynamic at the moment, Bishop.
If I could come back to you, Mr. Lekula, from a business point of view, in what shape does economic development look like on the African continent at the moment? I mean, we get people on this channel all day throughout the pandemic coming saying all our plans are on hold, we've cut back investment, we're cutting back wages, we're cutting back costs. From your point of view at PPC, what's your perspective?
Well, we were in a similar situation. Obviously, when the lockdown started throughout the continent, all our operations were affected. We had to stop operations. except in areas where we supply into essential services. But we have since bounced back. In South Africa, we got onto level 4 and we started operating. And I must say, at this stage, we're actually seeing a very positive movement in terms of like the activity within the operations. But going back into looking at the entire continent, I think this is one opportunity that it presents, is that we need to start trading with each other. And that's how we can bring business back into creating economic activity. There's a lot of positive movement from the government in Southern Africa that is talking about infrastructure development, which was exposed during this period of COVID in terms of the lack thereof. And the area in which the opportunity presents itself, and it's very well known to us as Africans, is the SMME, or what the so-called informal market. And that's where it lends itself to trading with each other, because every economy will have to look in within each other in terms of how do you get it to start boosting itself. So whilst we had this bad patch, I think what it has given us is an opportunity to reset and say, with everything that we have, how can we use that in terms of intertrade and actually get ourselves back into gear?
One thing, just a follow-up question there, Mr. Lekula. One thing I fear, looking at the world economy now, is that I'm afraid there might be a lot more inward looking from a lot of economies, and a lot more, for want of a better phrase, self-interest. They'll say, well, we need to sort ourselves out here, and we don't care so much about our neighbors and people on other continents.
I think you're right, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for Africa as a whole. Yes, you will require some funding to invest in terms of creating some of the jobs. But Africa as a continent, she's got almost everything in terms of the resources, in terms of the people, in terms of the age as well, is on our side in regards to the youth. So when we start looking inward, despite the lack of funds, Africa has got the resources to can do it on its own. And there is a lot of need for intertrade within the continent. If you look at the outside the continent, the view has always been the next phase of growth is going to be in this continent. And what we have been doing all along is take what we have as resources, purely half processed or unprocessed, and ship it away only to buy it back into our continent. So one of the things is to say, what are we importing as a continent? Do we really have to import it as a continent? And every organization out there that has got an aim of growing, chances are for their growth, they will have to look into this continent. And we need to start dictating the terms differently and say, if you want to grow, or if you want to use our resources, come into our continent, internally invest, and actually start converting those resources into some economic value. And therefore, the inward looking for Africa, if we really deal with it properly, we can actually make it work into our favor.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions for you now, Sandy Bakula. You say with your organization, Operation Hunger, you've been feeding the country for 45 years, quite a history, but you say that you always aim to feed no less than 10,000 families. First question I have for you, how many families do you think you're feeding right now?
During the period of the COVID-19, we have fed about 13,000 families throughout this period. However, that's not the only thing that we do, because we're not only just focusing on just feeding. You see, Bishop, the dynamics of food insecurity within the African context is that basically a lot of homes depend on cash and food to have access to food. So that is actually been the way that food insecurity has been measured. So throughout the years, what we have done is that we have actually developed models that assist communities and families, to basically integrate from actually depending from, like from different aids to food, and but just by creating sustainable projects that allow, for communities to be self-sustainable. And like if you remember, we've been through the different periods and different changes of the environments and different challenges, which is basically, that's why we have been able to be so much helpful towards this current pandemic at the moment, and providing insight, to stakeholders on how to deal with providing, like food security within this current context. So basically, it's quite an inward type of a process, and it works with integrating. So you have to basically be able to integrate people that are sitting, that are looking on immediate support, to having those people being independent and creating their own, like their own sustainable, income. Sorry.
Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But the follow-up question I have is that
Yeah.
13,000 families is laudable, but I've heard anecdotal evidence in this city alone, in Johannesburg, people begging from door to door for food because they've run out. Surely 13,000 families, it's still a tiny drop in a very large ocean.
That's correct. It's still a very much it's still a tiny job. It's a lot, but it's it's a tiny job in a large ocean. I mean, what this has presented, Bishop, is that what we've seen throughout this period is, we've had quite a lot of people that otherwise were, on sustainable income by themselves, that have actually added onto our existing beneficiaries. So it's been quite a bit of a challenge, but we've already started, with the resuming of level 3, which enables certain, industries to participate. So we've already started integrating those new entrances into our sustainable projects across the country. So, there has been quite a positive, a turn and drive into being able to.
Sorry, Sandy, are you
Sorry.
okay? Do you carry on?
We just had load shedding by me, so I was just trying to see whether I'm still connected.
You are still
So
connected, very much so.
yes, yes, basically ESCOM, yeah. So we have seen quite a positive spin towards, and I have to say, we have seen also a different interest from our donors, directly from private business as well, who have been quite flexible in basically making funding and resources available, towards the public. If we can see more of that, I think that will actually help us in basically making sure that the country is able to be healthy and actually is able to recover, back to normal.
So if I go back to you at PPC Cement, Mr. Lakula, you said earlier that you believe that it's up to Africa now to get the projects together and also be stricter in dictating terms to those who want to come here and invest. I don't think anyone in business would disagree with you there. The only problem you've got is that 4-letter word, which is going to come up after COVID-19, I think. The 4-letter word is risk.
Well, there's always risk, and that's the science of business. Risk weighed against return. I think one of the things that we can be sort of like pleased about, it was not very nice to see. I think the African leaders realized how much we have actually set ourselves to be vulnerable to such events. In the sense of what you were talking about with Sandisa, and also the infrastructure that we do not have in terms of housing people, in terms of infrastructure as in roads, hospitals, and the signals from our finance minister, for instance, is talking about we need to invest in infrastructure. And that realization that infrastructure kicks up the economy is actually very good. Now, the risk is always been there, and some of the risks are inherent to the continent. However, some of the risks are actually our own doing in terms of all the aspects that an investor needs to consider. But in terms of authorities, realizing that we have to invest in our people, we have to invest in infrastructure, that sort of like takes away part of that risk because there is a collective in understanding what needs to be done. And the future is always going to be about partnerships. Partnerships starting from the smallest business person in terms of the SMMEs to the government, to the bigger businesses like ourselves, and obviously the communities. That realization will actually be one fundamental that is going to be required to say very little companies can actually make it back into operations on their own. You will have to partner with someone, be it the government, be it the communities that you operate in, or other business within the same sector. And I think that collective approach to an investor says there is some commitment that has been made, and therefore it must somehow mitigate part of the risk.
If I can go back to you, Sandy Bakula, just to pick on what you were saying about getting people to start sustainable businesses and helping to feed other people, essentially what you're saying. That's going to be very, very difficult as well in the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 world. I mean, if you go to a petrol station these days, it's like walking into sort of a deserted hospital. People have wearing masks. It's uncomfortable. There are restrictions on where you can stand. How are you going to get over that to do what you want to do?
Bishop, we've already started, as I said. What has been very positive, what has happened with this COVID-19 is that, like the policymakers had at least provided us with environmental guidelines on what it means for a business to resume, its services, like per touch point of the business activity. And what we've done is we've taken down those like those contexts, those guidelines, and we've adopted and customized it to our specific communities where we work and to the different types of projects that we run, to ensure that we basically are already starting to resume on time. Because we're not only just looking at feeding type of initiatives, but we've got, like a small enterprise businesses that actually provide provide income back onto the community. So it is difficult because it requires you to have an additional budget, for the protective gears and the stuff that is needed to operate in this specific environment. But it's not totally impossible.
And just one other question before I go back to your colleague at PPC Cement. If I could just ask you, Sandy, I've been, again, like a lot of people, a lot of fathers, I've been to supermarkets as well on behalf of my family, and I've seen the supermarkets pumping out the food. One guy told me that he sold more in a week than he sold in 2 months in the old days before COVID-19. What's the supply of food like, but from the supermarkets for your scheme where you're trying to feed thousands of families?
During level 1 and level 2, because there were also guidelines, or there was restrictions on bulk stock and bulk procurement. So it was very, very much difficult. But what has happened is that what we've done is we've actually adopted other supply chain distribution channels where we go directly to the farmer right now that is closer to the community, obviously to bring down costs, to bring down logistic and distribution costs. And what we've seen over the past, it's a funny thing because we were actually just talking about it. What we've seen has happened, after during the course of the lockdown, is that the price increases on actual basic products within the stores has actually been quite astronomical. And the government had promised that they would set aside a regulatory that will watch the prices, like the price hikes. But we haven't seen that being in reality, because the price hikes, over the past few months, they have actually quite increased astronomically, and that creates quite a huge problem, because if you already have got people that are outside of jobs, and pay cuts from like pay cuts for others that are needing to basically purchase basic products, and the basic products are actually have gone high, how are we going to be able to mitigate that? So that creates a bit of a burden back to the incentives that have been provided, as relief during this period. So it's not really complementing, I think, what we actually trying to what we're trying to achieve as a country during this period of taking us and transitioning from the astronomical lockdown restrictions to basically the softened, and actually trying to get back and recover to the economy.
Now, if I come back to you, Mr. Lakula, the MD at PPC Cement, one question I know that you're interested in is, how do ordinary citizens, people who are out there maybe watching this broadcast, how are they going to take steps to try to get back their economic activity and their economic power?
Like I said earlier, they can't do it on their own. They need to look around and say, what is it and who is it that I can partner with to be able to get myself back on it. I'll give you an example. Us as an organization, we have had a strategy that focuses on SMMEs and newly started businesses. And from a business point of view, that naturally is seen as the high risk, because those are the vulnerable businesses at this point in time. However, we've taken a different step and said, how do we assist? And with all the mitigation of the risks that is involved with that small business, in terms of the credit that you issue, in terms of how you manage the stocking up of those businesses, payment terms, and all of that. How do we then, together with that business, be able to put something that is manageable? And it may come at a little bit of a higher cost, because now you've got shorter deliveries, and your loads are limited. However, it is a way in which we can all gradually come back into operating. And what we've seen is, together with most of our partners that deals with us, we have combined a view in terms of starting up. And government has to play its role. And I think they're quite aware of that. If you listen to the Minister of Trade, is always talking about buying local and supporting local. And that what it means is that it will create some jobs that otherwise would have been lost. And obviously, that will make a contribution in getting the economy to rise again.
Well, looking further afield, I mean, one thing that interests me is that your company has also got majority shares in Simerwa in Rwanda and Habesha cement company in Ethiopia. You're obviously keeping a close eye on those businesses as MD. How are they grappling, firstly in Rwanda, secondly in Ethiopia, with this COVID-19 pandemic?
Actually, the rest of the business in the continent, Simerva is a beautiful story. The country has been doing the right things all the time. You're speaking about the risk. It's one of those countries that are very attractive to investors. And in terms of their GDP growth, has been growing very well. We actually were out of business for almost an entire month when they had their lockdown. but it was properly managed and we got back into the operation. And currently we can't keep up with demand in a place like Rwanda. In Ethiopia, we never went into a complete lockdown, and business continued, and it's looking very, very good at this point in time. And these are areas where there is an observation. The whole of East Africa is actually really ticking okay in terms of the economic growth, with economies growing at anything between 6 and 8%. Even our operation in Zimbabwe, despite all their challenges, the business in terms of current operation has actually taken off quite smoothly. And we are operating together with the communities in which we operate. We've obviously contributed as a company to help the communities come off this particular pandemic. But at the same time, from the government infrastructure projects, it looks like they just couldn't wait for things to relax so that they can carry on with their programs. And we see demand in Zimbabwe actually picking up quite drastically. But like I said, I think there is a conscientization of leaders to say, build the infrastructure now because you're gonna actually need it. And your people are looking and saying, in this time, how do we actually survive as a country, and do we have the means to survive? And it has jolted most of our authorities into action.
And Sandy, just one last comment from you. I don't know if you saw the news overnight. Manchester United footballer Marcus Rashford in the UK was telling the Prime Minister that he should be feeding children. What about in this country? Do you think that some of the big names should step up and start pressuring for more hungry people to be fed?
That's absolutely correct. But we have seen quite a lot of those people, advocating, for more people to be assisted during this period. And we've seen like your Baron Habana, for example, our captain for Springboks has also been doing quite a lot of campaigning and assisting. And, we've seen also quite major big brands, specifically, within the food supermarkets, like your Pick and Pay, your ShopRite, your Spar. And Spar and, Spar and ShopRite specifically have partnered with us as well, throughout as an ongoing process to assist basically with the food insecurity. But we do need more of, the private sector to start also playing a part in social investment and actually almost, almost try and accommodate their policies to be more flexible to changing environments so that it is easy to adapt and very quickly, to such, to such astronomical condition.
Okay, Sandy Bukula, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. That's Sandy Bukula, the interim CEO, Operation Hunger. And also thank you very much, Njombo Lekula, the MD for PPC Southern Africa. That's all we've got time for on all we've got on that time for that CNBC Africa special. Do stay tuned after the break. We've got another special coming with Sanda Ojiambo of Kenya, the new head, the first African head of the United Nations Global Compact, the organization that looks after private business around the world. She'll be telling us about her new job and her first day at work. Do stay tuned. For me now, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.